Okay, I just went through and described this in like 15 minutes, and it was way too in depth, and then ran out of time. And what I'm going to do is more succinctly update you. So, welcome, first of all. Thanks, all you future subscribers and interested parties in unaccompanied refugee minors and qualitative research methods and social work in general and culture and acculturation and yeah, welcome. So, brief overview. It's been a long time since I've updated. I have come to the conclusion that I am using a grounded theory approach, Strauss and Corbin. I'm looking kind of at the 1990, 1997 versions. The newer version, the Corbin and Strauss from like 2007, seems to be quite a bit more interpretive than the previous iterations, and so I'm looking to stick more functionalist, a little more objectivist, as I look at developing a mid-range theory that tries to explain the way unaccompanied refugee minors define success and the way that the strategies they use to move toward their definition of success, and the way that that's supported or not here in the community. So the idea here is that unaccompanied refugee minors come to the United States, and we have kind of an idea of what we think would be successful: graduating high school, having a driver's license, having some independence, a bank account, and those tend to be assimilation factors. When the research talks a little more about acculturation being potentially a better strategy. I'll get into a little bit of that as we go, but so essentially that's my question. How do unaccompanied refugee minors for themselves define success, and what strategy do they use and find useful in achieving that? So in order to do that, I dove into the literature and spent a lot of time in a lot of different literatures, and found that there's some main themes that tend to emerge. First, almost universally, unaccompanied refugee minors experience trauma. It doesn't matter if they came into the program through immigration court as through the Department of Unaccompanied Children's Services or unaccompanied alien children into the URM program. It doesn't matter if they came from victims of human trafficking or obviously, or directly to the URM program from refugee camps abroad. Trauma seems to be the constant that they carry with them, and that's very well established in the literature. I'm not going to go into tons of depth into my literature review because that's kind of all that's been focused on, and so my interest is not in that, but I do want to incorporate that into or be sensitive of that as a main issue, and to try and take our understanding a little bit further about what that might mean. And so in order to do that, I've come across three theories or approaches or frameworks that I think are useful and have been underutilized or completely ignored in the unaccompanied refugee minor literature. So first one, Berry's acculturation framework and assimilation. Here I'm interested in I'm interested in having this inform the questions I ask these refugee minors in an open interview, asking, were there strategies around maintaining culture of origin and adopting new culture? Was there anything around that? And then also, is there, developmentally, is there an age where assimilation is preferable? If they're 14 years old and they have no real family ties at all, is it do they tend to be better off if they assimilate, or in other words, completely adopt U.S. culture versus maintaining any of their culture of origin? So there's the acculturation, assimilation. Somewhere in the middle there will be, I'm assuming, some discussion of development. which some of the literature speaks to that, identity development and things like that across cultures. So the other piece of acculturation theory or acculturation framework by Berry that I appreciate is that he accounts for situational as well as personal variables that affect the acculturation process. And so, this might be the type of resources that they have access to, or it might be the placement if they're in a traditional foster home, or if they're in a group home setting, or something in between, or residential treatment, or that might be a contextual variable that affects acculturation, but also it's a personal and individual characteristics and skills that come from the previous culture and are adapted for use in a new culture that can also affect the acculturation process. And so those two things I suspect will come out in my interviews as I ask refugee minors how they define success and what they use to achieve it. So I'm assuming there will be individual, personal variables as well as contextual things that contribute to that. So that's a helpful framework in those two respects. Next, I'm looking at, I don't know what this is really called. It's part of the positive development literature. Michael Ungar has done a lot of cross-cultural work looking at resilience across culture. I call it resilience across culture, attributed to Ungar. But the idea here is that culture has a relationship with resilience. And so being that trauma and adverse circumstances have been almost universally experienced in an unaccompanied refugee minor's life, and part of their life experience and part of their ongoing story, I think this theoretical piece will help inform the interaction between culture and resilience. So are they stigmatized for using cultural or coping skills from their culture of origin, or are coping skills that they used even feasible? Do they have to completely let go of their cultural context and any support systems they had based on their culture when they come? And how does that affect resilience? So just the whole idea of culture interacting with resilience is one piece that I feel like justifies the current study based on his resilience across culture approach. Second thing, Ungar is very strengths-based, person and environment oriented. Again, that context and personal. There's a person within the environment, very social work friendly, and something that's very understudied and underutilized, and a person's underutilized in the current literature. And it begins to justify the reason I want to ask unaccompanied refugee minors how they define success versus asking or testing, other cultural constructs that have been developed by experts or on other populations. I think it needs to be kind of an organic experience, and that seems to be something that this resilience across culture supports. Another approach, the third approach, is the capability approach. That it's a theoretical approach that comes out of economics. Sen and Nussbaum really are the big names in this piece, and it really hasn't been looked at all with unaccompanied refugee minors that I'm aware of. But again, culture is a huge piece of this. The idea here is that excuse me. The idea here is that traditionally we measure well-being in terms of access to goods and resources, or we measure well-being in happiness or desire fulfillment. And those are the two ways we can tell if you have positive functioning as a human being. And so what the capability approach does is incorporates a cultural lens into that. The way I am utilizing the capability approach is that it it places a cultural lens in front of that says, really, you know, even if people have access to goods and resources, if they're not um, relevant to the person's culture of origin, then they can hardly contribute to the person's well-being or functioning. And so, um, if if um, our culture says mental health issues, you got to have mental health services. A refugee comes here, and there are services available to them, but the provider is not culturally sensitive or humble enough for those services to be useful, or if the person, as in terms of their cultural context, doesn't see mental health counseling as valuable to their functioning, then it won't enhance their well-being at all in spite of the access. So the capability approach basically is to the ability to transform um, and decide your level of functioning, your ability to choose your functioning based on what's important to you in your cultural context. There's some I should do a much better job explaining it, but it's a pretty key feature, and I'll try to do a better job next time. There are some pieces that I need to review quickly before my next vlog, but. So culture, key component. Secondly, the idea that people are the best resources for asking what their desired functioning is. Essentially, that's my question. How do you define success? Or what do you consider positive functioning? Or what does well-being mean to you as an unaccompanied refugee minor? That's what I want to know. And so this is a little clearer way to incorporate um, a culture of context and what they might actually be able to achieve in functioning versus how we measure functioning in our Western culture and style. So justification for asking them, how do you define functioning, and what do you do? What are the skills that get you there? A pretty key justification for that as well. So Sen was reluctant to name specific capabilities that are universal, as in human rights. Nussbaum has really extended that work and has come up with 10 capabilities that she identifies as things that ought to be universal. Education, so the idea is not that the way I'm going to use Nussbaum's 10 capabilities really is to frame the way I start to think about the coding as I start to collect data. I'm not testing it. It's really more of a framework where people can say education was important, or friendship and relationships were important, or access to basic needs was the most important thing. Anyway, I think it'll be helpful in kind of starting to frame the ways that we start to define positive functioning or success as the refugees themselves define it. So anyway, that's what I'm looking at, using these 3 theories really to justify and to start to build a theory that's a lot more sensitive and organic to unaccompanied refugee minors. And I think another big piece is that we really need to look at it here in the United States, and we really need to do this from a social work perspective, seeing the person in a context and within an environment, but also as a human being that is deserving of respect and self-determination. So that's your update. I will continue as I get a chance. Thanks for watching.